right, good evening, everyone. My name's Tina McAndrew. I'm the director of the Randall Library in Stow. And for just over a year now, we've been partnering with Sustainable Stow to bring programming about climate change and many other topics. So this evening, here's one more month in, and I will hand it over to Rick.
Thank you, Tina.
You're
It's
welcome.
really been great working with the library. I'm looking forward as we get into the second year, well into the second year of programming now. So tonight,
20 people.
you've seen that its topic is, what's in your well water. And we've got two great speakers. Sarah Bauer will speak first. She's the technical specialist with the Mass Rivers Alliance and heads their technical assistance program, which supports member groups' efforts to protect streams and rivers across the state by working to strengthen river advocacy for stream flow protection and climate resilience. So she'll be up first, and then we'll hear from Jim Starbard, who's the Massachusetts state lead at RCAP Solutions. He's been there for 13 years. He leads their technical assistance and training efforts in the tri-state region of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. So we're very glad to have both Sarah and Jim with us tonight. Thank you both. Yes.
All right, good. Anyone can see me, and that's good. All right, we can start then. But good evening. I'm Jim Starbard, the Massachusetts State Lead. In here just to talk about water quality in your private wells. And I should say that we are funded by US EPA, and how we're going to be doing this under our homeowner training under our US EPA grant. So to give the credit where our funder is. Just a little note about RCAP Solutions. We're a part of a nationwide nonprofit. We're the Northeast branch there in purple. We also service Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. So there's an RCAP in every state and every US territory. And we focus primarily on drinking water and wastewater and private wells in small and rural communities under 10,000. So it's just a picture of me and my contact information. If you have any follow-up questions that don't get answered tonight or want to contact me for any other information. So getting started tonight, just want to go over some important points to remember about private wells. Private wells are not regulated like public water systems. So, it's up to the owner or the user to make sure the water is safe to drink and the system is maintained. Unlike a public water system, which is overseen by Mass DEP and has to be tested regularly, private water systems are completely up to the homeowner. Well water can be the best tasting, the safest, best tasting, and you might think it's the safest in the world, but contaminants are of real health concerns, really are odorless, colorless, and have no taste. And when lots of homeowners, this is definitely shown to be true. One of the major things I always hear about people don't like about their water is iron, but of course they put treatment in because no one likes their, white clothes to come out red, if you will, after doing the laundry. But it's the odorless, colorless, the arsenic, uraniums, the radons of the world that you don't see, but actually the real health issues. And the local Board of Health private well regulations govern the construction and testing of private wells in Massachusetts. So in Stow, the real authority in private wells is the Stow Board of Health, or the Neshoba Boards of Health, which is the agent for the Stow Board of Health. So today's topics, we're really talking about how a well is properly sited, understand where the water comes from, the surroundings, and possible risks of contamination, testing your water, and probably the most critical part of it in maintaining your well is testing the water regularly. We'll go over what to test for, where to test for, and what how to interpret what those results are. And then, like I mentioned, what to do with your testing results. So this is kind of where water comes from, aquifers, if you will. Up top there is unconsolidated sand and other materials. This is really your dug wells, if you will. The water just kind of seeps in through the seams and it's collected and pumped into the home. Down low, this is more common, especially in a more recently made well, is bedrock wells, which in Stow probably the most common. And what they're doing there is drilling into the bedrock and trying to get those water effusions you see in the rock. And the one in the middle in granite or the fractured rock to the left, they're really the biggest demonstrators of how that water goes. So as you're drilling down through that rock, you're trying to catch those little zones of water, and that's what fills the well and then provides water to your home. This is just another graph of it. Again, ones on the left really are the two ones we're going to see in Stow, the sand and gravel aquifer, which would be of a dug well, the older version of well, if you will, and then the bedrock well. And as you see, you know, with the bedrock well, the fusion where the water is, they're, you know, very random. So as you drill down, you just hoping to find, you know, get into one of those at appropriate yield, if you will. I've seen well logs, you know, 400-foot wells, and, you know, all the water's coming out at about 20-30 feet of that 400 feet. So it's really about where you catch those bedrock fusions and how much water quantity and quality you get. And this is just kind of a demonstration how a plume of contamination could come into a well. And as you can see in this demonstration, someone's home with a forest in between and then junkyard, you know, they can't see the junkyard, but that junkyard contaminated the groundwater and slowly but surely moved towards the home. This would be a, you know, a sand and gravel well because it's down into the bedrock. But just to kind of, you know, show you how once water contamination gets into the aquifer, how it can move and affect, you know, areas further away from the contamination source. So well types, like we went over, dug bored, no real aquifer. These are the really old ones, but being that New England, there's a lot of these still in use. In our, you know, our forefathers were really good at finding quantity of water, maybe not the best quality, being that it's a dug well, it's really could get bacterial contamination rather easily, but at the same time, you know, back in the day, they were really looking for quantity. Drilled and driven wells, these are sand and gravel wells. These are more the public water system. We don't really see these in a private well until you get down to the Cape, you know, more of a sandy area. And then the drilled wells, like I mentioned, the drilled well into bedrock, it's the most common that we would see in the new, a new well that's drilled in. Some cases you have choices. Most of the time, you know, the drilled well is the code of the town. You really don't want to, you know, go with the old school technology if possible. I have done that with oceanfront home, actually on Narragansett Bay, that they actually could not put a drilled well in, had to stay with a dug well, because if they drilled in, they were into brackish water, but the dug well produced potable unsalted water, so they had to stay with a dug well and, you know, make the best of it, if you will. And another thing I want to mention, the last one here, and we'll talk about it more as we go on, is the well log, the way water's coming from. Like I said, but in future slides, I'll show you about a well log, what it looks like. It's probably the most best piece of information you have on your well other than a water test. So dug aboard wells, just basically this is how they were done with a machine. A lot of ones in New England were dug by hand and you know, filled in with fieldstone. Nowadays they use concrete tile. It's kind of like almost like concrete donut, if you will, and they stack together. And water seeps in from the water table, the bottom, and the thin lenses, and just basically fills the void, and which is then pumped in from a jet pump in the basement. Dug and bored wells is, again, just more pictures of it. The one on the right here, the one that has the nice concrete top, the nice circle, that's about as best you can get for a dug or bored well nowadays. If you were going to stay with a dug well and not upgrade to a bedrock well drilled into the bedrock, this is about what we'd recommend to be about as best as you can make it, as far as bringing it up to, you know, code for nowadays and keeping bacterial contamination out of the dug well, which dug wells are just prone to, you know, more common to have bacterial contamination. So bedrock wells, it's just on the right kind of diagram of it. So it has a steel casing, usually seated 10 to 20 feet in the bedrock, sometimes further, 30. I've seen them actually go in all the way to 100, 120 feet just to case off some of the top water fusions coming from the bedrock, because some of that water sometimes down in Northern Rhode Island, I know a well driller down there cases it off because the top fusions always have a lot of iron, so he casts those off and gets the water from more down below. He ends up with water without iron. But usually a bedrock 10 to 20 feet, casing 10 to 20 feet into the bedrock with a steel with a grout put around the side. That way it's a waterproof seal that keeps the surface water from getting into where the groundwater is, because the groundwater has been cleaned by the earth and usually is free of bacteria, so it's good for potable drinking. And bedrock wells, the water and cracks comes in from cracks and fusions in the rock. The one thing about bedrock wells too, though, that can be influenced over long distances, because as you can see, those fusions, they don't have a rhyme or reason how far they go. So, you know, some of them can go aggressively to the top, some could go, you know, miles to get down, you know, a couple hundred feet, if you will. So it's something to keep in mind that it can be influenced over longer distances. Well considerations, well depth, deeper is usually better, not always, but usually. The further down the water goes, usually the better treatment it is, the less chance of having a bacterial is. Location on the landscape, you know, you ideally like it, you know, if you happen to have a property that has kind of a hill to it, you know, you'd rather have your well above the septic system, if you will, as opposed to below it. So, you know, location on the landscape and where all the kind of contamination would be coming from. Groundwater flow direction usually goes with topography, not always, but usually, you know, but you know, I've also seen ponds that are fed by springs on top of a hill. So obviously that, you know, doesn't pan out all the time. And again, areas surrounding your well where the contamination might be coming from, i.e. next to a junkyard, i.e. next to a fire station, an airport, all these things could, you know, kind of make you think about what kind of contamination your well might have an issue with. Correcting poor construction, you know, wells technology has changed significantly in 30 years. The invention of the pitless adapter, so that way allowed us to bring wells out above grade as opposed to below grade, below the frost line. You know, many existing wells are so-called grandfathered in, but you know, it's been good enough and they just kind of stay that way. Many wells and pits, again, even if it's a drilled well in a pit, it's just a source of bacterial possible contamination. And as we see on the right here, the pit can even fill in with water, and then, you know, you have risk that surface water gets into your groundwater and contaminates your well. And many hand dug wells, like I mentioned, are still in use today. So ideally, you know, if they should be upgraded to a drilled bedrock well to really, you know, save them from bacterial issues. And two problems, and you know, really provides an opportunity for surface contamination, and it's a safety hazard. These pits have very bad, a lot of them have bad covers. They go down several feet, so it could really be a safety hazard if, you know, an animal or child or even some of them a full-grown adult were to fall into it.
Wish we knew exactly where our well was.
So what do I do with these wells? Well, bring them up to code, hopefully, and to protect the quality and provide a safer residence. So extend that pipe above the land surface, above 12 to 18 inches, what we say above grade is really what the casing should be on. Fill in with clay grout to get rid of the safety issues. Install the pitless adapter if that's the reason why it's in a pit. And you know, talk to your well authority, which is your board of health or some contractors beforehand, and find out the best approach. But ideally, you know, if your well is in the ground, whether it be a drilled or a dug well, ideally it should be above grade to protect you and your family and from bacteria. Abandoned wells, again, these are another big issue. You know, well logs weren't required until about the 1960s. There's still a lot of well logs and wells that were drilled in the 2000s that you know, there's no well logs for them. So there might be tons of abandoned wells out there. We don't know where they are. If they're, you know, safety hazards, if they're in pits, or if they're a dug well with a bad cover. You know, these are all you know, safety hazards that we might have to deal with. And also sources of contamination, because basically it's another hole into the groundwater. So, you know, again, surface contamination can easily get into the groundwater, basically a straw going right into it. So if you have an abandoned well on your property, you really should, you know, properly, you know, abandon it, fill it in, you know, and to make sure that, you know, the safety hazard primarily, but also the contamination of it, you know. So definitely something to keep in mind if you do have one of those on your property. And this is just some of the stories of abandoned wells and some of the tragedies that have happened of it. And this is actually a story from 2020 in Connecticut that we ran across. You know, just moving a friend into the house and fell into the basement fieldstone well. The house was basically built around. So these are out there and very common here in New England, being as old as the area is. Well caps is one thing I really wanted to stress. You know, that if your well is above grade right now, great. The second step would be is what kind of cap do you have on it? The biggest way to know if you have the right cap in is which way the bolts are. If the bolts are vertical, you probably got the right one. As you see on the right, you got the vertical bolts, and the big magic thing on it is that rubber seal that you see in between. And that's what's going to keep all the insects and any other surface contamination out of your well. The non-sanitary well cap on the left, you can see it has bolts going horizontally in. And that does not contain any sort of gasket. So if you were to lift that up, there's most likely some sort of insect material, other evidence of, you know, things that are getting into your well. And that is more than enough to get a total coliform positive bacterial result. Another thing to keep in mind too with the sanitary well cap, and even if you have it like that, is all the bolts are in. They're not over tightened, because if they're over tightened, they break, which is something I actually just saw yesterday. And also the electric junction you would see, the electric conduit go in, is that securely in. That seems to either come out from frost heaves or get hit with the lawnmower, whatever it might be. But that also seems to be an area of the well cap that seems to break apart and leave a void into the well very commonly. So wellheads, again, all the bolts should be tightened 12 inches off the ground, especially if you're in a flood zone. Do not have pooling or depressed areas around the wellhead. The exposed wiring really shouldn't be there. You know, insects, casings, no holes in the meshiest screens. As you'll see all the way on the right, that wire that's going into the wellhead, that's actually used to be a screen for the well. The contractor found it easier to just knock out that screen and run the wire than to actually do it the proper way in the electric junction. Just a common thing we see. So something else to keep in mind. Keep it away from brush. You really want a good, 2-3 foot clearance in all directions around your well. If the animals feel comfortable and pests feel comfortable to hang out around your well, they will. And like I mentioned, the sanitary well cap, again, very vital part. And there's just a couple more pictures of the wellheads. The one in the middle there is that screen I mentioned, kind of like what a straw in a soda. You put your finger on the top, the water, stays in the straw, you take it out, air behind water to make it come up easier. Same idea. The big thing is to keep that screen intact, or it becomes an entryway into your well for contamination. Like I mentioned, the well logs, these are a couple of them online. They're available at an NG Environmental Affairs data portal, or if your local Board of Health also have your well log information. But the big thing about these is it really gives all the information on your well for when it was drilled, how deep it was, where the water fusions come in, what the pumping test was, where your pump is set, when it was made, all that information could be in this log. So if there's one piece of information you can have on your well, other than a water test, of course, is a well log. It's really going to give you a vast amount of information. And these are the newer ones, if you will. This is, electronically done. If you have an older home and an older well, they might look something like this, if you will. The good old paper versions way back. The one on the right is from the Neshoba Area Board of Health, which is who sort of Stow. The one on the left is kind of like the old school ways they filled them out. And as you can see, it was the paper there. It made like 3 or 4 copies. Get the name off the top of my head. Haven't used them in years. But as you can see, it had a Board of Health copy, and another one to the well drill that stayed, one for the owner. So this is what the well logs would look like. And ideally, if you can get your hands on this, if you don't have one, look at the state website or at the local Board of Health. It's a wealth of information for you to have. Natural groundwater quality, there's a lot of information already out there on what might possibly be there. Stow, is actually why we tested around that area. It's a natural, northern central Massachusetts, is known to be a hotbed for arsenic, uranium, radon, now PFAS. So, investigate what you might be able to find a lot about the natural groundwater in your area online. Mass DP has tools for that too. And like the middle one here, contact your local board of health with any kind of nuisance or health-based contaminants that might be specific to your area. I know Stow does have the PFAS issue, I believe, in 2 different parts of the town. If you're in that area, right now PFAS isn't a recommended testing statewide, but if you're in that area, yeah, you probably want to test your well for PFAS. So your local board of health might have more information on different issues that might be going on in your specific area where your house is located. In another community, contact the local health agent before I did a well assessment one time, and he let me know that the home actually was right next to an old town landfill that has since closed, and they were required by Mass DP to test regularly to make sure the groundwater wells weren't getting contaminated from the landfill. And this just so happened the homeowner that I was going to meet, that home was unoccupied at the time. They couldn't test that well, and they never ran back to test it. Information like that for that homeowner was huge for him to now know that, hey man, I better test my well for dioxin and all the other stuff might be coming from the landfill. So, information like that, the local health agent might know a lot more than what the statewide regulations or recommendations might be. And know what contaminants are a potential problem in your area. This is just one of the Mass DEP tools. You can enter your address for probability arsenic, uranium, and we'll spit it out based on USGS studies that were done for arsenic and uranium previously, I believe, around the early 2000s. Surface sources, you want to isolate your well as much as possible from any contaminant sources. Again, know the groundwater flow if possible. Usually goes with topography, not always, but usually. And note that any possible sources up gradient might be coming towards you. Because like I said, groundwater usually runs with the topography. This is just some setbacks. It's from the university, this University of Minnesota. So different things, and maybe I don't want to go over every one of them for the sake of time, but just show you, different things you might want to keep an eye out, and how far back it should be. The one thing I did want to point out about this though is it does say 50 feet from a soil absorption system, septic leach field. It's actually 100 in Massachusetts, so that's why I wanted to point that out. This is Minnesota standards, but I really wanted to show the slide, just kind of show you all the different things to kind of keep in mind, everything from animals to fuel to, you name it. If anything could possibly get into your groundwater, you want to keep it far away from your well as possible. Okay, so into sampling now. So where do I collect the sample? Ideally, usually from the kitchen sink. That's usually where you're going to get the water from for your drinking and eating. So, and definitely don't want to get it from outside tap. It's just, the risk of getting a false positive on your bacteria it's just really high if you're outside and not in a controlled environment. And, you always use a Mass DEP lab. We always recommend that. I'll show you how to look up one of those soon. And a good lab will provide all the detailed instructions, the containers, anything you need. So ideally, if you're dealing with a good lab, they should walk you through anything you need, give you everything you need, and then bring back and have it analyzed. So water quality testing. So what should we test for? Well, in Massachusetts here on the right, this is what they recommend be tested for. Basically, every 5 to 10 years, test for everything on this list. Other than once a year, they recommend a bacterial and a nitrate sample. The reason why they recommend bacteria, nitrate annually is because it is it's not a chronic issue. It's an acute issue. You can drink an E. coli tainted water and get really sick and die, one time. Or nitrate, a baby, blue baby syndrome can come on very quickly from nitrate water. So that's why, you know, as opposed to the chronic ones, the arsenic, the radons, uraniums, yeah, we don't want to ingest them, but it's really the 20, 30 years of ingestion that would cause the issues down the road, if you will. So hence the different strategies of testing. We always recommend testing for bacteria in the dead of summer, July, August, September. That's when you're really going to get the right, you know, an accurate reading, if you will. Insect activity is up. Rain, you know, we're getting storms all the time. We're getting thunderstorms, lots of water activity. Just biological processes are up because of the heat. It's just a better time to get a true test of your well. So we always recommend taking it in the heat of the summer, if you will. And it's also when public water systems seem to have the biggest problems with bacterial issues. So hence why we always recommend, if you are going to do that, well, we recommend you do that yearly bacteria nitrate sampling, but do that in the summertime to really get a accurate result. So where do I get it analyzed? We always recommend and only recommend Mass DEP certified labs. We know everything's on the up and up. Again, a good lab will give you everything you need, the detailed instructions, the bottles, the chain of custody, everything you should need. And you know, ask questions till you're satisfied. You know, you're the consumer, they're doing, and you know, they're a business that's wants your money. In what I've my experience, you know, most labs are eager to help you out. And you know, make sure that you get everything you need and make sure you're happy with the results in the product. So this is where you would find a Mass DEP certified lab. It's just you just go on, or you can just Google Mass DEP certified water labs, and this will pop up. It's a search engine. You would pop it in by town or by region. It would just spit out the labs that are certified in your area, and pick one and you know, test your water from there. But anyone on this list will meet the criteria of Mass DEP, and you know, be on the well, on the up and up. Interpreting results, you know, there's a lot of information out there. You know, a lot of documents out there that might help you through it. I'm going to show you a tool in the next one. If something has found you well, you know, really should resample to confirm, especially bacteria, the total coliform, E. coli. You know, total coliform is present everywhere. It's on our hands now. So there is a possibility of a false positive. So we always recommend resampling, especially for a bacteria. And this is actually just standard practice in Massachusetts, but if bacteria is present or total coliform is present and have an E. coli test performed, that is standard practice in Massachusetts, that if total coliform comes, the lab automatically will test for E. coli to see if they're, so, you know, total coliform being a indicated bacteria, just an indicator of something going wrong, if you will. E. coli, knowing that there is something wrong, as human pathogen bacteria in the water, don't drink the water, if you will. So that's something we do. But at the same, for the total coliform, it's kind of like you know, if there's something going wrong, but if there's an E. coli, that's, you know, do not drink the water and under any circumstances till it's, you know, fixed, if you will. The Be Well Informed tool, this is a tool that was actually invented by New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, but they were nice enough to share it with Mass DEP, and Mass DEP put the Massachusetts standards into it. It's basically a tool that you will get your lab results back from the lab, and you can just punch the numbers that the lab gave it, and it will spit out what you should do. A, you know, is the result good or bad? B, why is it bad? And C, what you do about it, what kind of treatment you should pursue to fix that problem. So it's a really good tool. It really spits out the information in a homeowner level, and you know, gives the homeowner some guidance on the next steps if something in their water sample is bad, if you will. So you know, I'm kind of wrapping up, so I just want to say it's all about being aware. So you know, understand if you can get your well log, it's the best thing you can have, because it's going to have the depth, the pump setting, the screen, etc. You know, so really know where the water's coming from. Know if you're naturally occurring contaminants or water quality issues in your area. And the biggest thing you can say is sample your well. You know, because without that sample, you'll never know what's in the water, because all the real problem ones are odorless and colorless. The secondary standards, the irons, the manganese is, you know, they don't look well. They're not going to make your clothes or your toilet bowl look good, but at the same time, you know, it's not something that's going to give you cancer after 30 years ingestion. I just want to put this in there because I know I guess Stow is having you know, does have some PFAS issues. So what are PFAS? Just in case people didn't know, they're man-made chemicals. There's thousands of these. PFAS, PFOA are kind of the generic most common ones, but there are thousands of these. You know, used in stain resistant, water resistant, non-stick, firefighting foams. Firefighting foams seem to be the biggest ones in drinking water so far. Can't say for sure that's going to be the biggest one, but right now firefighting foam seems to be the biggest issue and causing drinking water problems. But this is in food packaging, outdoor clothing, carpets, leather gears, e-wax. I mean, you name it, it's in it. It's persistent in the environment, hence the forever chemical nickname. It leaches in the groundwater from spills, landfills, even air deposition. I've heard about this in New Hampshire. You know, a smokestack with PFAS in it, contaminating a whole area by air. What is PFAS? It's linked to health risks, particularly in immunocompromised individuals, women who are pregnant, nursing, and infants. It seems to be the primary issues that people have. In Massachusetts, we have a PFAS drinking water standard of 20 parts per trillion of these 6 PFAS chemicals. Again, as I mentioned, there's thousands of these. We look for 6 and regulate 6, the PFAS, PFOA. I should say this drinking water standard only applies to public water systems, not private wells, unless the local Board of Health institutes a regulation. So unless the Stow Board of Health says, you know, private wells must be tested for PFAS and meet the Mass DEP regulation, there is no PFAS standard in Stow. I know of only one town right now that tests, that requires testing for PFAS, and that is Harvard. And it's only in a certain part of town close to Route 2 where they've had PFAS problems. There's no federal standard for PFAS and PFOA. There's only a health advisory only. And I will mention, this is kind of breaking news, came out today, but that health advisory by EPA was substantially changed. And PFOA was brought down to 0.004 parts per trillion. So they call them quadrillions. And PFOS was brought down to 0.02 parts per trillion as a health advisory. So I imagine this health standard is going to change. Again, EPA just put this advisement out yesterday, and Mass DEP, what I'm hearing, is digesting it as the rest of the country, because it is an EPA health guidance, and it will be applicable to the whole country. Right now, it's a health advisory. It won't be a standard, but health advisories usually become standards. So, and just a diagram of how you know, PFAS and PFOA get into exposure into the human, and pretty much every human being probably has some sort of PFAS or PFOA concentration in their blood. I've heard that polar bears in the Arctic have concentrations of it in their blood, so it is unfortunately not an uncommon chemical any longer. And I just wanted to mention this, just closing, we did have private well legislation filed. Didn't make through this legislative session, but we are hopefully that they're going to file it in the next state legislature after the, you know, next 2023. So just a little heads up, you know, we're hoping to standardize private well regulations in the Commonwealth. Right now, there's 351 different ways of doing private wells. Each and every Board of Health gets to set their own regulations, which is unique in public health, considering that there's a state minimum for pretty much any other health code that local boards of health enforce: the food code, the housing code, Title V, beaches, camps, you name it. So really is to give Mass DEP the authority to write a statewide private well code. Doesn't say what should be in it. They'll leave that up to the experts in public hearings, but really try to get a minimum standard in the Commonwealth for private wells. So at that, I've done everything I want to cover, and I'd be happy to take any questions or either now or at the end.
I am concerned that we get to Sarah, but I've got one question. Maybe we'll take a second one. Janet asked, if you find an error in the uploaded well log, how do you get it corrected in the DEP database? Is there a program in place to get older logs entered into the DEP database?
Yeah, if you notice something that was wrong, best probably would be to contact DEP, the well drillers program. There is actually a program going on right now. The well drillers program got funding to try to update all those old records, try to get some addresses to them. A lot of them have lot and parcel numbers. The wells were drilled before the house was built and the street was built. So, 20 Main Street was, lot and parcel 4A, and that's how it kind of stayed. So there is that effort going on right now to try to, get those well logs that are there and A, make sure they're accurate, and B, try to find a place for them, because someone, like I said, that just has some sort of lot and parcel number that means completely nothing at this point.
Okay, and one other came in from Jen. Is high iron in kitchen sink water a health risk?
No, high iron doesn't have a health standard. It's completely a secondary standard, what they call a non-health issue. It's Buddy who likes to hang around with manganese in Massachusetts has a standard of 0.3 milligrams per liter. 0.05 to 0.3 milligrams per liter is considered a secondary standard, again, a aesthetic standard, if you will. But iron, there is no standard for health that's been set by Massachusetts or US EPA.
Okay, and I guess I see Alan has his hand raised. We'll take one more before we switch. Alan?
Yeah, hi, thanks. I see Marcia Rising from our health department. Our Board of Health is on the line, and I'm just wondering if she can tell us. I've got a house that was built around 1950, so like 70 years ago. So where are the well logs for houses from my era, Marcia? Are they with your group, or does the building department have those, or nobody has those? Not sure if Marcia is still there live.
Yeah, I'm laughing because we have a couple of notebooks from 1960 and forward. We have papers in the files in the office. I do not know if your well log or anything about your well, Alan, would be in there, but you're welcome to come into the office and ask and look.
All right, well, maybe someday I'll do that. Thank you.
I guess a related question quickly, and then we really should switch to our second part. How would a landowner know there is an error in their well log?
Wow, I mean, oh, go ahead if you.
Yeah, what was the question?
How would a landowner know there was an error in their well log?
That's a good question because it's never arisen.
Hi, this is Janet. I asked the original question. So I had a copy of my well log. I went to the DEP database and I saw what Jim mentioned was that they didn't have any address linked to that well. And I thought maybe that was a confidentiality thing. And then I looked at the Latin long and those weren't correct. It wasn't even on my property. So that's what I meant by a correction. I had two pieces of information that would allow me to check what DEP had.
I know nothing about the well log, other than what we have in the office, which is filed with us when the wells are drilled.
A conundrum.
A conundrum, yes. Again, if you want to come and check and see what we have in the office in your file, for your property. You can see if we have the correct, and somehow it was, when it was submitted someplace else, it was done incorrectly. I don't know.
But it makes sense that the error that a landowner might know is the location, address, or something like that, not having to do with the depth and what it found and stuff, because only the well driller knows that.
Only the well driller knows that, and we get the information from him. We do get the information about the depth of the well and so forth. But a long time ago, you know, we did not have very well kept records.
Why are all well drillers Sullivans?
All right, I think it must be time to change topics a little bit. And we can come back to more questions at the end. Sarah, are you ready to get your screen working?
Yes, I think hopefully it'll
And I'd
work.
remind everybody to put yourself on mute again until we get going.
Okay. Can everybody see the presentation, not the back end of the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yay, it worked. Okay, yeah. So just to introduce myself again, I'm Sarah Bauer, Technical Specialist with Mass Rivers Alliance. Our organization is a statewide nonprofit, and our mission is to really protect and restore rivers and streams across the Commonwealth, and to also connect watershed and environmental groups statewide in this mission as well. So today I'll be talking a bit about, where our groundwater comes from for water supplies and how drought is impacting our water resources. So what's remarkable about groundwater and the ground ultimately that we stand on is that it's able to hold water but still stay solid. So often when people think of groundwater, many visualize a river or stream running underground, but that's not the case. Groundwater, as Jim had mentioned, is just the water that's held underground that fills those tiny spaces between rock particles and the cracks of those rocks. It is one of our most valuable resources, even though you probably never see it or even realize that it's there. To put it into perspective, there's over 1,000 times more water in the ground than is held in our world's rivers and lakes. And ultimately, water enters the ground through rain and melted snow and seeps downward beneath the surface due to gravity. And then that water is held in large storehouses called aquifers, as mentioned in the previous presentation, which are really just that saturated zone, as you can see here, beneath the water table. And this groundwater feeds our rivers and streams and lakes, and it also feeds our communities when we drill wells into these aquifers and pump water out. Most people in the United States receive their water from private groundwater wells versus being supplied by the public water system. And that's about 13 million people nationwide. But Stow is a really good example of a town that's actually fully supplied by private wells, so there's no municipal public water system in that community. But many communities in Massachusetts, however, do rely on both private wells and public water systems. And the point I really want to emphasize here is that despite whether you're on the public water system or if you're getting your water from a private well, all water is connected, and the water that you draw from your wells is connected to the same water source and often the same aquifer as your neighbor. Many people think that there's this infinite amount of groundwater, but that's not the case. Your aquifer can only support so much pumping. And if we're using more water than what we need, we can really draw down water in our aquifer, and that eventually causes our wells and even our neighbors' wells to eventually run dry. And this becomes especially problematic when there's little to no rain, because if we think about the water cycle, groundwater is recharged when rain seeps into the ground. So during droughts, our aquifers become depleted more quickly as there's that lack of recharge happening, and there's more reliance by our communities on these groundwater supplies. Within the last 6 years, Massachusetts has experienced 2 of the worst droughts on record. One was in 2016 and the other was more recently in 2020. Many rivers throughout the state during these 2 years experienced record low flows, and even portions of some rivers went dry. For example, during the 2020 drought, the North Nashua River in Leominster experienced the lowest flows it's seen in 85 years. And that's just one example, but we saw this statewide. And these lower stream flows also lead to other impacts. They begin to degrade water quality by restricting the flow of water downstream, which in turn, can deplete oxygen levels in the water column and cause fish kills. Lower groundwater levels impact our water supplies for drinking water purposes. For instance, during the 2016 drought, several municipal water sources became depleted, and that led to 6 communities actually declaring water supply emergencies. And then in addition to those, we also see impacts to the agricultural sector and our economy. Farmers suffer serious economic losses due to crop failures. During that same drought in 2016, we saw farmers suffered more than $18 million in economic losses due to the drought. So here you can really see the sheer magnitude of impacts drought has, both ecologically and economically. The 2020 drought I want to touch on a bit. That lasted 7 months from June to December, and it extended through a period of time where we often see and also rely on rainfall to recharge our groundwater and surface water systems. Here on the slide is a map of the drought status for September of 2020 that year. And as you can see, the state is delineated into 7 different drought regions that allows for some flexibility of drought response actions for the different areas and watersheds across the Commonwealth. So from left to right, we see that there's the Western region, Connecticut River Valley, Central, Northeast, Southeast, and then Cape Cod region, and also the islands. So here in September of 2020, the whole state was in at least a level 2 significant drought, as indicated in the lighter orange color, with several areas being declared a level 3 critical drought. Those are the darker orange. This posed serious threats to our state's wildlife, to our water supplies and our businesses, and also, even limited recreational opportunities along our waterways. And now, we would assume that during a serious drought such as this one, water conservation should be a key priority for towns and municipalities statewide. However, instead of private and public well users banding together in water conservation to preserve our water resources, what we saw was really this confusing patchwork of conservation measures that had very limited impact. And that's because our current approach to drought management is really just allowing towns to decide what they institute for water conservation measures, if they even institute them at all. That causes a lot of variation across watersheds. So here you can see this. This is a map showing the non-essential outdoor water use restrictions by municipalities during that same time in September of 2020. So non-essential outdoor water use is any use that is essential to business or to growing food. So that's so isn't essential. I want to make sure I said that. And so that's, like irrigating your lawn through a sprinkler system, or also, washing your car or washing your house, etc. And you can see that these neighboring towns drawing water from the same water source and often the same aquifers in some cases are implementing totally different measures. And this is really because our state currently lacks the authority to require water conservation during droughts. The Secretary of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs can only actually recommend outdoor watering restrictions, but they can't actually require them at the moment. If you look at this map, dark red are the water supply emergencies that were declared then. The brighter orange is municipalities that put restrictions on 1 day or less per week for outdoor water use. The lighter orange is 2 days or more of watering allowed per week. Then the yellow, we see that there's voluntary restrictions. So that's, restrictions aren't required, but maybe some users are doing it in their communities. No color whatsoever shows that there's no restrictions that are required. And then gray, which is, also indicative of Stow over here, is where there's very small or no municipal water supply. So also no, restrictions necessarily required. And I also want to point out what you don't see here is all of the private residences that also reported private well failures. So in 2016, to give you an example, there were more than 200 residences that reported well failures. So just keep that in perspective when you're thinking about water conservation. And climate change will only increase the frequency and the severity of droughts in our region. So our state needs to have a better, more coordinated response. An important goal of drought resilience, I'd say, is to sustain stream flow and groundwater as long as possible when precipitation is scarce. So, the best way to achieve this goal is really through conservation and water conservation, because it's the most effective, it's immediate, and it's also least costly. Previous studies have shown that even limiting non-essential outdoor water use, while it sounds minimal, it can have a significant positive impact on our rivers, streams, groundwater supplies. A analysis or report that comes to mind is one done by the Charles River Watershed Association a few years ago that demonstrated that between 20 to 50% of water use was saved when restrictions were imposed effectively. There's a proposed drought bill that will directly tackle this problem and would really help our state maintain adequate water supplies through effective drought management. This is the third legislative session that this bill has been proposed for, and it's actually the first time that it's been reported out of the House. So that's actually huge. It's now before the Senate Ways and Means, so they can decide if they're going to report it out as well, and then it gets voted on. So there's the potential for this to actually be put into legislation. And this bill, would give the Secretary of EEA the authority to require restrictions on non-essential outdoor water use across a drought region during declared droughts. And all water use that is not essential for business or growing food would be subject to these restrictions. So that means that, agricultural businesses or golf courses, those would be exempt from these restrictions. And also, so would vegetable gardens in your backyard. If you're growing food, if you're watering, your gardens to grow food, then that's also exempt, but obviously not a flower garden. And these outdoor water use restrictions would escalate as the drought levels worsen. And it's also detailed and consistent with the state's drought management plan. And then lastly, the point I want to make is that this is, and it's probably one of the biggest points of this bill, is that it applies to all water users. So that includes private well users, in addition to those on the public water system. So it'll put everyone on the same playing field and offer a more consistent and uniform approach to water conservation statewide. So here I just wanted to show a snapshot of the non-essential outdoor water use restrictions that are spelled out in the state's drought management plan. So for a level 1 mild drought, communities will need to restrict water use to 1 day per week outside the hours of 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. to minimize losses to evaporation, because that's when it's hottest during the middle of the day. And then a level 2 significant drought would limit outdoor watering to just handheld hoses or watering cans, also outside the hours of 9 to 5. And then a level 3 critical drought and a level 4 emergency drought would impose a complete ban on all non-essential outdoor water use. So this bill is a great next step in making Massachusetts waters more resilient in the face of climate change by really exercising a consistent and effective approach to drought management through water conservation. And, this is especially important as we're already seeing drought this year. Actually today, the secretary declared that there's a level 1 mild drought for 3 of our drought regions, for the Connecticut River Valley, the islands, and also central Massachusetts. And they're also declared a level 2 significant drought for the Southeast and Northeast regions. So that's 5 regions that have a declared drought to some level. So, while some may think that Massachusetts is pretty water rich, our groundwater and surface water supplies are finite. And we've seen this in the 2016 and 2020 droughts through water supply emergencies, fish kills, economic losses, et cetera. And when we think of the water cycle, we often forget that humans do play a major part in it, and that our actions, like watering our lawns daily during a drought, can really change the dynamics of the water cycle. So as climate change, continues to threaten our water resources and our aquatic ecosystems, it's important that we do our part and change our practices to better sustain our resources for the future. And that's all I had. So I'd like to thank everybody and open it up for any questions. I know, I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but. Oh, I think you might be muted.
I was going to say, you're okay. We've got some time. I mean, it also depends. There's no hard stop. Alan put a long note in the chat and pointing out that which river, the Assabet is already quite low.
Mm-hmm.
Less than 25% of the typical flow for the state.
Yeah, could I make a further comment on that, Rick? That's currently that website, which I watch all the time. It's really fascinating to watch the river flow go up and down as it rains. We just had a rain, 3-4 days ago? And you can see on the graph there on that website how that impacted the water level went significantly up after that rain, but it's now been dropping like a rock. And before that rain, it was even lower. It was approaching the lowest level of flow in an 80-year historical record for that date, whatever that day was, in the end of May. So we are in this area, in this watershed, already experiencing significant low flow in the Assabet. I was out for ores on Sunday morning at 6 o'clock doing water quality sampling for ores. And where I could wade into the Assabet River, and it was only up to in between my ankles and my knees deep. in places just upstream from Stow. So be careful. We're already approaching what looks like not a good year for groundwater in this area.
Agreed. Thank you, Alan, for those points. And I do want to mention that Mass Rivers Alliance sits on as I guess member or on the task force for the drought management task force. So we often send out emails to our member groups to ask, like, are you seeing drought implications right now in your watersheds? Please let us know, send us pictures, and we relay that information at the drought management task force meeting so that they can see the implications of it on the ground as well. And that can, further influence the drought declarations for the regions.
Yeah, Sarah, it's hard for us to show much dramatic photo footage because the Essabet is so impounded.
Right. So even just an email about what you have been noticing would suffice too. It doesn't have to be an image.
Okay.
William has his hand raised.
So we in Stow pump water out of the ground and we use it. And then we put it back in the ground in our septic system. So is it true that the only loss that we have is if you do water your lawn or something like that and you have evaporation? We don't have municipal septic systems that are taking all sorts of water and putting them back in rivers after having been fixed, hopefully.
Yeah, so there are evaporative losses in that way. I'm not sure I can speak upon the other losses due to the septic systems, but I mean, you are correct.
Carol Lynn has a comment in the chat on presentations in Acton that she's seen. I don't know how familiar you are with Acton situation, Sarah. Carol, do you want to explain?
Sure. I have seen presentations in Acton about their water usage and availability, especially related to a lot of new development and industry going into Acton over the next 10 years that's predicted. And they are looking at potentially exceeding their water usage or water levels amounts that they can use within 10 years. It's like a really big concern. And so my question is, if, there's no walls around the aquifers, right? So if Acton runs dry, are they going to be pulling? I mean, what happens to surrounding towns? Because, water sort of moves into the void. So are all the towns' aquifers going to drop down if Acton's, seriously drops down?
I think it would depend on where they're going to get additional water from. So if they could tap into the MWRA and purchase water from them, if that's the case, then they can't. So I believe that Acton has a permit for the Water Management Act. So the Water Management Act manages and regulates any large water withdrawals over 100,000 gallons per day on average. And that's if you are taking additional water in addition to if you already have a registered water use as well from dated back to the early 1980s. So they have to meet the conditions of their permit or else they're subject to consequences of that. So I would say that since their permit limits them, I know that they had, I think they're 20-year permits. So if you're saying that they're going to go over what their permit allows them, then they have to look at other options. I wouldn't suggest that if you're pulling water from one aquifer, it would necessarily impact another aquifer. Depends on if they're confined or unconfined. But I would say that, it might have impacts otherwise if you're receiving your water if you're buying it from another municipality and it's being transported in, then that would have effects on the donor subbasin. Ultimately, it would have impacts, but not necessarily right next door, depending on where the additional water comes from. Hope that answers your question.
I guess my question is more is as they're draining and homeowners keep pulling water,
Mhm.
are they going to start pulling water? Is it just in the ground going to start leaching from other aquifers because there'll be, there's drier, if you have a high aquifer here and a low aquifer here, is water going to go from the high to the low?
I'm not certain. I'm not a hydrologist necessarily, but I would say it would depend on the type of aquifer that you have and that you're pulling your water from.
By the way, there was a water study done in, I think in the 60s in Stow. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, we have at least 3 recharge areas in Stow. So we're very fortunate where there is ways for water to get into the aquifer within our own town. So it's not as if a lot of aquifers come from miles away. And so you're counting on that water entering the aquifer, in some places hundreds of miles away. And that's what they're worried about out west, where they're pulling deep, deep wells that are coming off of water that's been down there for decades.
There's a note from Janet in the chat that says she saw a presentation last week by Acton Water District, and their map showed that they rely on groundwater resources in Acton, Littleton, and Boxborough.
A little bit further light on that. At ORS, we've been monitoring what I call the water war going on between Acton and Littleton. Because Acton has decided to expand its take of water from the Gog Pond, a pond which actually sits on the border between Littleton and Acton, but because of ancient legislation back around 1900, they have the rights under state law to take all that water, even though some of it sits over Littleton's land. And there's been litigation over this. By and large, Acton has won it. Littleton is currently fighting back by allowing wells upland from the pond. And Acton is very unhappy with that because they fear it will drain water take water that would otherwise be draining into Nagog Pond. This is the water war that's currently ongoing. Just further comment on Carol's question. I think we have a series of aquifers that are a little more confined, such that we shouldn't be too worried about how dry they get up there in Acton because of what Bill just said about our aquifers here in Stow. We have a number of them, and we have a lot of wetlands, wooded wetlands, that are collecting and storing water and feeding our aquifers. So I'm hoping, I can't be sure, that we'll be a little better off in the long run than Acton will be.
Thanks.
So there's another comment from Janet. What can we do to evolve water management on a watershed basis rather than town by town? Oh, well, good luck.
That's a great question. I think it does, lead to the bigger conversation of how our water is managed statewide. So that's through the Water Management Act program, as I mentioned earlier. And that is done more on a watershed basis, how they look at permits altogether for large water users within a specific watershed, and they have a safe yield for how much water can actually be drawn from that watershed during the lowest times of year. And so I would say, making sure that our permits really have conditions that that allow the municipalities to be held accountable to do more water conservation and to really mitigate the impacts of their withdrawals. If they're taking a lot of withdrawals, then they should they should have to, put it back. They should have to do recharge projects. They should, and I know a lot of this is written into the Water Management Act program and should be, implemented as a result of the whole Sustainable Water Management Act initiative that came up in 2015. But we're still seeing that the state, doesn't necessarily hold municipalities accountable to do the most amount of water conservation that can be done. So I think that, being involved in these permit renewal conversations, these are permits that last 20 years and they're up for actually renewal right now. So being involved in that conversation, advocating for what you think should be put into, management, into water management into your watersheds would, I think would assist that process, as well as, doing non-essential outdoor water use restrictions on your own in your private well areas, if that's, if you have a private well at your home.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Jim, do you have any, I realize, these two topics are overlap and don't overlap in some ways. They're similar but different. Anything else from you before we wind up for tonight?
No, I think she covered it pretty well.
Okay.
Rick, could I just jump in with a kind of a third related topic? We've talked about, private wells, and we've talked about our aquifers, but, I had mentioned the Assabet River. There's actually a different set of issues that have to do with our water bodies, our rivers, streams, and ponds. In that, many of them, most of them, are contaminated with mercury. Not something we generally have to worry about in our private wells, but it's one of the reasons why there's a fish advisory throughout this entire area against eating the fish that you catch in the Assabet River, because mercury runs up the food chain, and the fish have a significant amount of it in their flesh. And it's a terrible issue. There aren't a lot of good answers to this. This is my plug for OR's annual meeting will be coming up in about a month. And there's a speaker we're having about the issue of mercury in fish in our local water bodies.
And as I remember, Alan, the mercury comes from polluted air.
That's right.
Power plants, things like that.
In Ohio, in Indiana.
Right. All right. Well, I want to thank both of our speakers. I also want to thank Amy Shea, who helped set this up for us tonight. Yeah, she's Stow resident, CEO of the Health Foundation of Central Massachusetts, and helped put this session together, and that was terrific. Thank you, Amy. So thank you both, Jim and Sarah and Tina, wherever you are. I don't see, you're here somewhere. Oh, there you are. For hosting us tonight. Great session. Thank you. Thank you all.
I want you all to notice that Edmund Green has a parka on. He is on a boat on the water. That's why he's so cold.
I noticed that too. Yeah, I don't know where he is, but you're on mute, Edmund.
I'm down in Narragansett Bay, Jamestown, Rhode Island. So
Very
the
nice.
water's beautiful here.
Okay, well, good night,
Thank you,
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Good night. Thank you.